es el profesor John Duncan, que viene de la Universidad de California, Los Ángeles. Él es doctor en Historia por la Universidad de Washington y realizado la mayoría de sus estudios sobre Corea en Corea durante muchos años, y sin duda uno de los grandes o de los pilares de los estudios coreanos, no solamente en los Estados Unidos, sino en todo el mundo. Él es profesor, bueno, ha sido el director durante más de 15 años del Centro de Estudios Coreanos de la Universidad de California, Los Ángeles. En la actualidad sigue siendo profesor en la universidad y, bueno, tiene muchísimas, no voy a para decir las publicaciones, libros que ha hecho, pero sobre todo están especializados en la historia premoderna de Corea, especialmente en el periodo Goryeo y Choson. Y también lo que quería destacar también, sobre todo de la figura del profesor Duncan, es también los últimos años ha tenido un papel muy importante en el desarrollo de los estudios coreanos en el mundo hispanohablante. Él ha sido gran promotor de lo que es los estudios online de estudios coreanos para toda Latinoamérica, todo el mundo, también para España, para todo el mundo hispanohablante. Fue el iniciador de este proyecto que se llama la e-School of the Korean Foundation, y que en la actualidad, aunque tiene su centro en la Universidad de Nuevo León en México, realmente el iniciador fue él y sigue siendo un gran promotor de estos estudios para toda Latinoamérica y para España también. Entonces, no solo, como podéis observar, no solo es digamos, una figura dentro de los estudios coreanos en inglés o en Estados Unidos, sino también en español. También ha sido de gran apoyo, para que también quisiera dar las gracias aquí públicamente, para los estudios coreanos aquí en la Universidad de Málaga, apoyando sobre todo nuestros estudiantes de posgrado, dándole. De hecho, él lleva 3 semanas aquí en Málaga dando un curso de posgrado para nuestros estudiantes de doctorado y máster. Y bueno, cuando le ofrecimos esta posibilidad de inaugurar, pues realmente siempre nos dijo desde el primer momento que sí, que no tenía ningún problema, y siempre ha estado apoyándonos en todas nuestras iniciativas. Por eso realmente agradecerle que esté aquí con nosotros hoy. Y nada más, le vamos a dar la palabra, que el protagonista es él. Y bueno, John, thank you very much for your kindly accepting our invitation to come for this opening conference for the Congress.
안녕하세요. Y buenos días. Porque no puedo hablar bien en español, tengo que hablar en inglés. Lo siento mucho. So, good morning. First, let me say that I am truly honored to have been asked to give the keynote address for this exciting assembly of Spanish scholars on East Asia. I would also like to express my deep appreciation to the organizing committee, to the president of the association, for inviting me, and to the University of Malaga for hosting this gathering. I've been in Malaga now for about 3 weeks, teaching an intensive course on Korean history to some of the graduate students here. I've really enjoyed working with the graduate students, who I find very interested and very smart. I've also greatly enjoyed the hospitality of the University of Malaga. It's been nice. Unfortunately, I have to leave tomorrow. My wife is waiting for me, and she's the boss. Okay. Although Antonio gave you what appeared to be a rather lengthy and detailed introduction to me, it still seems to me to be best for me to begin with a brief discussion of who I am and how I came to be a scholar of East Asia, and particularly of Korea. It all came about as an accident. Back during the years of the Vietnam War, the United States Army said, "Come here, boy." And so I had to go into the United States Army. The United States Army sent me to Korea. And while I was serving in the United States Army in Korea, I developed an interest in Korea, its culture and its history. And I managed to learn a bit of Korean language. And so after I got discharged from the Army, I returned to Korea as a student. And I spent more time learning the Korean language before I enrolled in a university there. And so that's how I got started. As you know, I am a professor of Korean history at a major university in the United States. Although I am a specialist in Korea, I have had extensive training in Chinese and Japanese history as a graduate student. I have team-taught courses on East Asia with colleagues who are China and Japan specialists. I've engaged in joint research projects with scholars of China, Japan, and Vietnam, and I have taught general survey courses on East Asian history. Thus, even though I am a Korea specialist or a Koreanist, I believe that I have a fairly broad perspective on all of East Asia. Second, it goes without saying that my positionality as a professor, as a white male American, informs, in some ways very obvious and in some ways subtle, the way in which I view East Asia and Korea. Nonetheless, I hasten to point out that I received my undergraduate education in Korean and East Asian history at a university in Korea, where my professors and fellow students were all Koreans, and where classes were conducted solely in the Korean language. As a consequence, I believe I have insight into and empathy for how Koreans understand and narrate their history. Over the years, I have engaged in several joint research projects and have team-taught a number of courses with Korean scholars. Simply put, I feel that Korean scholars and I, even though we sometimes disagree on issues or points of interpretation, share a common sense of mission. I have also participated in several joint projects with scholars from China and Japan, and thus feel that I have some understanding of how they view their histories and their cultures. It is this background that gives me the audacity to address the topics I will raise in this talk today. I should also say that although what I have to say is based generally on what has transpired in Anglophone North America, that is the United States and Canada, I think it also applies to some degree to Europe, based in part on the common cultural heritage of the Enlightenment, but also in large measure on the way in which North American and European scholars of East Asia have come to form a community in which English has become the lingua franca of contemporary scholarship, and in which we read and build on each other's work. Okay, enough about that. I want to talk first about the problem of Eurocentrism and the study of East Asia. Eurocentrism, in my view, and in many people's view, has been a major, if not the major problem in Western studies of East Asia since at least the late 19th century. Some of you may wonder why a US-based scholar is raising the issue of Eurocentrism and not that of Americentrism. To be sure, Americentrism has been a problem in such fields as economics, sociology, political science, international relations, and even contemporary history. And it has been even more so since the collapse of the Soviet bloc some 3 decades ago. American social scientists believed that the American system was the universal system, the world was America's oyster. Yes. However, I do not think that we can deny that interpretations of the European experience, and particularly those of Western Europe, have formed a common point of departure from which we understand non-European experiences and have provided the standards by which we measure the achievements of non-European people's histories, cultures, and philosophies. Let us consider, for example, what has been arguably the most influential textbook on East Asia over the past half-century. A 2-volume history written by John King Fairbank, Edwin O. Reischauer, and Albert Craig of Harvard University, titled East Asia, the Great Tradition, and East Asia, the Modern Transformation. Despite the author's well-intentioned and probably at that time appropriate attempt to overcome conventional interpretations of East Asian history, such as the essentially circular dynastic cycle approach. In the end, they remained largely mired in Eurocentric notions of pre-modern Asia as a fundamentally traditional order that was only modernized by the challenge of the West in the 19th and 20th centuries. To be sure, the view of the non-West as an unchanging traditional order has come under heavy criticism since the 1980s, as seen in the famous Edward Said, in such Indian scholars as Dipesh Chakrabarti and Yatri Spivak, and the California School of World History. Nonetheless, it seems to me that Eurocentric biases still remain. These biases can be seen in the recently popularized field of world history. On the one hand, world history seems to question Eurocentric views, defining world history as a macro history that is trans-regional, transnational, and transcultural. In other words, it is not about the history of individual nations or regions. Rather, it is a search for interconnectedness and commonalities among various locales throughout the world. Some practitioners of world history emphasize cultural interchange, others economic and technological exchange, others ecological issues, demography, and even the transmission of diseases. But all focus on the way in which these elements transcended regional and national boundaries to bring about far-reaching historical change. And all share, to greater or lesser degrees, the belief that history is a process of evolution from simple to complex that has yielded improvements in the quality of human life. Am I speaking too fast? It's okay? All right. I have a tendency to talk fast, so. And I'm getting thirsty. Many periodization schemes have been advanced for world history, varying according to the interpretive things scholars select and according to the ways in which individual scholars, understand the transition to the modern. Almost all of these periodization schemes, however, stress the importance of the early modern, usually understood to be the time from roughly 1500 to 1800, as they're of the beginning of globalization and as the precursor to the modern, which is characterized by the rise in Europe of industrial capitalism and of world-spanning empires that ushered in today's era of globalization. Thus, despite the presence of influential voices from Asia, Africa, and Latin America critiquing world history as overly centered on Europe and calling for a more polycentric approach, I believe that for many of its practitioners, world history remains fundamentally, if not consciously, Eurocentric. So let me turn now to the question of how Eurocentrism has affected interpretations of the history of Korea. Despite the fact that Koreans had been writing their own national histories, perhaps, since at least the early 12th century, it was scholars in Japan who, in the late 19th and early 20th century, first applied Western-style, so-called modern concepts and methods to construct new narratives of Korea's past. Those Japanese scholars who had embraced Western notions of history as linear progress through ancient, medieval, and modern stages believed that Japan had followed the same path of historical development as European countries, and also said that Korea, and for that matter, China as well, had not followed the proper path. According to those apologists for Japanese colonialism, the features of the Korean historical experience included rampant factionalism, stagnation, that is, remaining stuck in the ancient stage of history, heteronomy, that is, having always been ruled by outsiders, and a higher culture that was nothing more than an imitation of that of China. such a depiction of Korea was, in fact, I think, a little different in essence from the ways that the British depicted India, the French depicted Indochina, and Americans depicted the Philippines. Korean responses to Japanese depictions of their heritage were varied. But following liberation in 1945, scholars in both North and South Korea have sought to overcome colonialist interpretations by striving to demonstrate that Korea too had followed the same path of historical development as Europe and Japan. They have argued, for example, that in the 17th and 18th centuries, the sprouts of capitalism appeared in Korea, that early modern thought had developed, and that society was moving in the direction of dismantling the old status system in favor of greater social equality. Known in South Korea as the internal development theory, or the Daejejeok Pancheon. This approach represents, in my mind, the internalization by Korean historians of Eurocentric models of historical interpretation. Although some younger scholars are now attempting to move beyond the internal development theory, it still occupies a hegemonic position in academia and in South Korean culture at large. Turning now to Eurocentrism and the study of Korea in the West. Although a handful of European scholars were beginning to do research on Korea in the middle of the 20th century, it was in the United States that the field of Korean studies began to flourish. Stimulated by U.S. participation in the Korean War and by Cold War era rivalry with the Soviet Union. Although it is probably inappropriate, probably not fair, to say that U.S. scholars were perpetuating Japanese colonialist views, there is no doubt in my mind that Japanese scholarship had some influence on the formation of U.S. scholarship on Korea, along with Cold War modernization theory and even some degree of Sinocentrism. The 1960s, for example, saw the publication of a number of books on Korean politics, which emphasized the baneful effects of factionalism on Korean political life. At the same time, historians, in what can be seen as producing a corollary to modernization theory, tended to depict pre-modern Korea as a remarkably enduring social political order whose very stability was a major impediment to modernization. At the same time, there was a tendency among U.S. scholars of China, particularly those focusing on cultural history, to regard Korea as little more than an eastward extension of China. Furthermore, there was an effort to understand pre-modern East-Interstate relations in John King Fairbank's studies, which described such East Asian countries as Korea, China, and Vietnam as derivatives or interesting variants of Chinese civilization, and posited shared Confucian cultural values and interest in trades as the underpinnings of what Fairbank called the tributary system, in which Korea, often said to have been more Confucian than China itself, was depicted as being the model tributary state. From the first unification of Korea by the Kingdom of Shilla in the 7th century until the demise of the so-called tributary system at the end of the 19th century. These various approaches tended to dominate U.S.-based scholars' constructions of historical and cultural narratives up until the 1990s, when a new generation of scholars in both the United States and Europe, inspired in part by what we might call postmodernism, began to take a more nuanced approach to differences and similarities between Korea and its neighbors, to interrogate conventional interpretations about the formation of nation and nationalism, and to express skepticism about teleological informed schemes of historical periodization. These new approaches, however, are faced with certain difficulties because of the spread of world history and East Asia's place therein. In the current situation where our colleagues studying China and Japan have enthusiastically embraced the concept of the early modern to situate their countries in the mainstream of world history. Those of us studying Korea who have doubts about teleological narratives of history find ourselves in a dilemma. If we argue that Joseon era Korea, that is Korea from the 15th to the end of the 19th century, also shared features of the early modern, an argument that actually is not difficult to make, then we find ourselves engaging in a fundamentally Eurocentric narrative of history as linear progress. But if we refuse to do so, then we find ourselves in the position of placing Korea outside the mainstream of history, in much the same way that apologists for colonial Japan had done 100 years earlier. We have no easy answer to this conundrum. It's something that I would agonize over quite a bit if I were a brilliant philosopher of history, then maybe I could come up with an answer, but I'm not. I'm just an ordinary practicing historian. Many of us have opted, somewhat reluctantly, to go ahead and talk about an early modern Korea in order to keep Korea in the conversation. It is at this juncture of struggling with persistent aspects of Eurocentrism that we have to cope with yet another problem, a growing tendency among scholars to restore China to its rightful place at the center of the East Asian world. So let me talk a little bit about the question of Sinocentrism, seen from a Korean perspective. There is no doubt that prior to the 20th century, the people of China tended to see their country as the center of the world, not just of East Asia, but the whole world. That worldview had no small influence on the way that Western sinologists have seen East Asian history and culture. Because Western sinologists are using what? They're using Chinese sources. Now, this kind of influence can be seen, for example, as noted earlier, in the Fairbankian model of the so-called tributary system, and in the tendency of historians of China to regard Korea, Vietnam, and Japan as, at best, interesting variants of Chinese civilization. It is also true that at certain times and under certain circumstances, the elites of Japan, Korea, and Vietnam also regarded China as the center of the world as they knew it. Indeed, it would be foolhardy to deny that throughout much of history, China has exercised varying degrees of political, economic, and cultural hegemony in East Asia. It's a fact, I think. Although the Trump administration keeps reminding me there are alternative facts. Okay. Having said as much, that is that we have to recognize that China did exercise some hegemony, I would also contend that it has been equally foolhardy for us to reduce all East Asian countries to mere replicas or extensions of Chinese civilization. Anyone with more than a passing familiarity of the societies and cultures of Japan, Korea, and Vietnam can easily recognize that the differences between those countries and China are at least as great as the differences between, say, Germany and Italy. Nevertheless, the recent rise of China as an economic and military power has prompted the rise of what I will term a wave of new Sinocentrism that shows signs of once again marginalizing other East Asian countries. One of the areas where this new sinocentrism is evident is that of international relations. In recent years, there has been a revival of interest in the so-called tributary system, resulting in a spate of articles and books arguing that such a system can serve as the model for the future of international relations in East Asia. Some of these scholars have written in search of an alternative to what they see as a very problematic realist school of international relations, while others appear to be engaged in a genuine effort to find a way to manage the numerous territorial conflicts that plague East and Southeast Asia. But others tend to essentialize pre-modern interstate relations as the tributary system, as an arrangement that managed to achieve long-lasting peace throughout the centuries prior to the eruption of Western imperialism in the 19th century, because China was able to dominate its neighbors not by military force, but by its cultural superiority. They go on to contend that a newly rising China, and they do love that term, rising, will be able to dominate its neighbors by virtue of its economic might and its cultural soft power. These arguments tend to ignore the way in which many historians of China have shown over the past 3 decades that Fairbank's formulation of the tributary system was based on a faulty and one-sided understanding of the actual nature of interactions between China and its neighbors. This romanticizing of pre-modern interstate relations in East Asia has ramifications beyond the pages of books and journals. More than once in recent years, I have been told by historians of China that the PRC, the People's Republic of China, has a historical claim to the ownership of Korea, because Korean monarchs for centuries had recognized the suzerainty of Chinese emperors. When I respond that tributary relations between Chinese emperors and Korean kings were at most ritual idealizations that had no impact on the autonomy of Korean kingdoms, these scholars simply dismiss me as a spokesperson for modern Korean nationalist sentiment. So I find myself dumped right along with the Koreans as a nationalist. Maybe I am. I'm certainly not an American nationalist, not in the age of Donald Trump. In the mid-2000s, a serious diplomatic row broke out between China and Korea when China asserted the claim that the ancient kingdom of Goguryeo, which had ruled over northern China and much of Manchuria for several centuries, and which had always been recognized even by the Chinese as a Korean kingdom, was actually a part of Chinese history. Wow. This was a claim that was based in large measure on the belief that Goguryeo had entered into a tributary relationship with a North China-based state known as the Northern Wei in the 5th century. Now, never mind that the Northern Wei was actually a Turkic state and not a Chinese state. The fact that it was in Chinese territory means it was Chinese, according to my Chinese friends. More recently, the U.S. President Donald Trump stated, after meeting with the PRC leader Xi Jinping, that Korea used to belong to China. He learned something very interesting. No doubt there was discussion of the North Korea problem during the meeting between Trump and Xi. Trump's statement suggests, at least to me, that Xi may have been pressing some sort of a historical right to exercise hegemony, if not direct rule over Korea. One wonders, yeah, I know I'm beginning to sound like a conspiracy theorist, One wonders if Xi and Trump were not engaging in some kind of backroom deal over the future of Korea, similar to the secret Taft-Katsura agreement of 1905 that granted Japan control over Korea in exchange for Japanese recognition of U.S. interest in the Philippines. I don't trust the Trump administration. I worry about this a lot. To be sure, much of the rhetoric of tributary relations, particularly as recorded in Chinese records, reflected such Confucian values as hierarchy and loyalty. But the Chinese sources failed to record such events as the 6-year war between Tang and Shilla in the 7th century, a war that began when Tang attempted to assert direct rule over the Korean Peninsula, and ended when Tang finally gave up and withdrew its forces from the peninsula in 676. And there was, for example, the turn of affairs in the early 17th century when Ming China requested Joseon Korea to send forces to help it contain the Manchus, who were beginning to rise as a power in the Dongbei region. The Chinese emperor reminded the Korean king that Ming forces had helped Korea to repel the Japanese invaders. And of course, he reminded the Korean king of his duty of loyalty to the emperor. The Korean king did send forces, reluctantly, but he gave secret instructions to his commander in the field to determine which way the tide of battle was going and to commit his troops to the winning side. That hardly sounds like a sincere commitment to Confucian values from the Korean king to the Chinese emperor. These and many other incidents call into question the extent to which Confucian culture was actually able to determine the course of action of Korea, or for that matter of Vietnam, where repeated instances of armed conflict with China was a major feature of that country's history. Simply put, even a cursory survey of historical interactions between China and its neighbors suggests that the currently fashionable representations of pre-modern interstate nation relations in East Asia as a harmonious system based on Chinese Confucian cultural hegemony leave much to be desired. Turning now to questions of culture. It has long been accepted that virtually all of East Asia's higher culture originated in China and spread out in waves from there to peripheral peoples such as the Koreans, the Vietnamese, and the Japanese. As a general proposition, this may be true, at least if it's considered in the same light as the spread of Roman and Greek culture throughout Europe. The problem is that in the case of East Asia, this has been taken to an extreme. One of the reasons for the relative late blossoming, that's late compared to the study of China and Japan, the relatively late blossoming of Korean studies in the United States was a generally accepted attitude among scholars in the 1950s, 1960s, and beyond that Korean culture was an imitation, or at best, an eastward extension of Chinese culture. That attitude still persists in some circles. Several years back, I was part of an outside review team examining Harvard University's Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. Obviously, I was there as the person looking at the Korea program. A Chinese specialist from one of the United States leading universities at that time questioned the need for having a Korean program, since in his view, the differences between Korea and China were no greater in degree or kind than the differences between Beijing and Sichuan. Needless to say, we had a spirited exchange. And I'm happy to report that my Japanese Dutch colleagues jumped in on my side. Yes! When seen from Korea, the development of some important aspects of Chinese and East Asian culture came about as a result of what we might call feedback from the periphery. For example, the rise of meditational Buddhism, known as Chan in Chinese, Sun in Korean, and Zen in Japanese, has long been regarded as a uniquely Chinese adaptation of Indian Buddhism. Some years back, however, a U.S. scholar with substantial expertise in Buddhism in both China and Korea published a well-researched monograph indicating that one of the seminal texts of the meditational school of Buddhism in China, the Sutra of Adamantine Absorption, or the Vajrasamadhi Sutra, was actually written in Korea and transmitted to China by Korean monks who traveled there in the late 8th century. So the implication is that the rise of meditational Buddhism was not simply and uniquely Chinese. We also had important Korean input. Another example of such feedback can be seen in printing technology. The Chinese of the Song Dynasty were the first to develop movable type using ceramic in the late 11th century. This new technology came into Korea, where the Koreans, perhaps because their ceramics were not as durable as those of the Chinese, changed over to metal movable type, which they used to print a book known as the Sangjeon Gogum Yemun in the early 13th century. Evidence exists showing that this practice spread back to China and beyond during the years of the Mongol Empire. These examples suggest, at least to me, that it's much more useful to consider East Asian culture, not simply as something that spread out from China to the periphery, but rather as something that developed and spread as a process of complex interaction between the Chinese and their neighbors. Next, I return to my own discipline of history. I mentioned earlier that scholars from Asia, Africa, and Latin America have voiced criticisms of the Eurocentric bias of world history, calling instead for a more polycentric approach, for a multi-centered approach. As one who shares the concerns of those critics, I have welcomed the work of the California School of World History. The California School is made up of a group of scholars such as Kenneth Pomeranz, Arvin Wong, and Jack Goldstone, who have taught at universities in the state of California, hence the California School, and whose interests focus primarily, although not exclusively, on economic history. The California School, which is highly critical of the East-West dichotomy that has characterized much scholarship over the past century, has been writing in conscious rejection of Eurocentric history and has advanced arguments that there were more similarities than differences between the early modern Chinese and the early modern Western European economies, and that China was at least as highly developed as Western Europe up until the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century. They further contend that the rise of the Industrial Revolution in England came about not as a historically determined consequence of an exceptional pattern of evolutionary development, but rather as the result of what might be termed an historical accident, made possible by such factors as the location of large deposits of fossil fuels close to population centers, the availability of slave labor from Africa, and access to the resources of the New World in the wake of European colonization of the Americas. While the research of the California School has represented a major challenge to Eurocentric interpretations of world history, It has, somewhat ironically, also created new problems for historians of other East Asian countries. Their contentions that the Chinese economy was at least as large as that of Western Europe, or indeed that China was the center of the world economy up through the end of the 18th century, feed into the kind of Sinocentrism that worries me and many of my colleagues working on East Asian countries outside of China. It implies that there is a historical precedent for the widely anticipated rise of China to become the world's largest economy, that China will inevitably recover from its 150 years of humiliation to resume its position as the richest and most powerful country in East Asia and the entire world in the decades to come. All of this has important practical implications for the way in which research and teaching on East Asia in the West is developing now and will likely continue to develop in the near future. I've been teaching at UCLA for 30 years now. And I have taught many courses, graduate courses in Korean history while I've been there. Throughout all that time, I have had many students majoring in Japanese history come and take my courses. I've had students with primary interest in Southeast Asia come and take my courses. I've even had the occasional person working on European history who got lost and wandered into my classroom. I have yet to have a major in Chinese history take my courses on Korea. There was one exception. That was a Korean student who had come to UCLA to study Chinese history. That was it. My colleagues studying Japanese history at UCLA report the same thing. They get a lot of my students studying Korea in their classes. They get students studying Europe showing up in their classes. They don't get students studying Chinese history. When I talk about this phenomenon with my colleagues at other universities in North America, they report the same thing. Graduate students, PhD students who are working on Chinese history will take a lot of courses on China, and because they are required to take some other fields outside of China, they will opt for taking fields in Europe or the United States. What troubles me about this, beyond the way in which some of these people seem to think that East Asia begins and ends with China, is the way in which universities and colleges in the United States recruit faculty. That is, at least history faculty. Well, I think that's probably also true in international relations, political science, and other areas. The vast majority of state universities and private colleges in the United States do not have the resources to hire historians for each of the countries of East Asia. It costs a lot of money to have a historian of China, a historian of Japan, a historian of Korea, and maybe a historian of Vietnam in a small history department. So these colleges, these universities and colleges opt instead to hire one historian to cover the entire region. Nearly all of these job postings, nearly all of these advertisements for such positions in East Asian history specify, for I suppose understandable reasons, a preference for a historian of China. It makes me shudder to think how these narrowly trained historians of China might be teaching the histories, societies, and cultures of Korea, Japan, and China. I had the chance to see a syllabus on a survey course on East Asian history that was prepared by a China specialist, a China historian in the United States, semester was 15 weeks long. 13 weeks was devoted to China, 1 week to Japan, and 1 week to Korea and Vietnam together. So much for East Asian history. Finally, let me briefly discuss the issue of so-called Asian values. As many of you are surely aware, for well over the past 100 years, it's been commonplace for scholars in the West and in the East to argue, a la Max Weber, that Confucianism, with its bias against merchants, its collectivist tendencies, and its emphasis on loyalty, was a major impediment to successful modernization in China, Korea, and even Vietnam. The exceptional case of early and rapid modernization in Japan has been explained by, no surprise here, the relative weakness of Confucianism in that nation. However, in the wake of the remarkable economic development of the so-called Four Tigers of South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore in the second half of the 20th century, by the 1980s, many scholars, including influential social scientists in the United States, turned the understanding of the relationship between Confucianism and modernization completely upside down, and began to argue that such Confucian values as education and respect for authority were the key factors behind the rapid economic development of the Four Tigers, an approach that has come to be called Confucian capitalism, or in its political corollary, Confucian democracy. This view, which was enthusiastically embraced by such East Asian politicians as Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, as well as by conservative scholars in South Korea, Taiwan, and elsewhere who supported authoritarian regimes, lost favor following the Asian financial crisis of 1997, when it became evident that there was something lacking in these poor countries and other Asian countries' ability to deal with this crisis. But it's begun to reemerge, led largely by the leaders of the People's Republic of China, who, after decades of Maoist denunciation of Confucius and Confucianism, are now seeking to reconstruct a new Confucian identity for the Chinese nation. And in my view, to use Confucian values to justify and strengthen their authoritarian rule, much as Park Chung-hee in Korea had done in the 1970s. If the California school was trying to overcome the East-West dichotomy, the advocates of Confucian modernity are trying to reinstate it by positing essentialized cultural differences between a Confucian China, and by extension a Confucian East Asia, and the West. This time with China-centered Confucian Asia on the superior side. Okay, I think I should wrap up before I put you all to sleep. So I'll give a few final comments, and then I'll close. Today, I have tried to give the voice of many North America-based scholars about the baneful effects of Eurocentrism and more recently Sinocentrism on the ways in which the histories and cultures of Korea, Vietnam, and even Japan have been narrated by scholars, presented in the media, and ultimately understood by the educated public. I believe that these concerns are shared by many of our European colleagues. I hope that today I have been able to show that these issues are not merely the concerns of backward-looking historians leafing through the musty pages of documents stored in obscure archives, although that's what I do a lot. But also, these issues have important implications for current and future developments in both East Asia and the entire world. I also hope that I have encouraged those of you who specialize in China to not be like students in North America, and to consider widening your focus to examine other East Asian countries and to consider the perspectives of those other countries on China and the world. Thank you very much for listening. 감사합니다.